My name is Lisa Falk. I'm head of community engagement for the museum, and I'll serve as your host. As many of you know, the Arizona State Museum is part of the University of Arizona, and we're located in Tucson. We are situated on land that has been stewarded by and home to Indigenous people for 13,000 years. Today, the Tucson area is home to the O'odham and Pascua Yaqui, and there are 22 federally recognized tribes with reservation lands in the state of Arizona. The museum's collection and research focus on the Indigenous people of the Southwest and Northwest Mexico, and we present programs exploring the history and cultures of this region. This particular Zoom series is in association with our exhibit Wrapped in Color, Legacies of the Mexican Serape, and I know I've been promising that we're working on an online version of the exhibit. Fingers crossed, maybe next month, but we will have it on our email newsletter. If you're not in our don't get our newsletter and would like to do the evaluation at the end and include your email, and we can add you to our list. So tonight I'm happy to welcome all the way from New Mexico, Dr. Ronda Brulotte, and she is Associate Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies and Associate Director for Academic Programs at the Latin American and Iberian Institute at the University of New Mexico. She received her PhD in anthropology and an MA in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. She's a two-time Fulbright Garcia Robles Fellow to Oaxaca, Mexico, where her research focuses on local craft economies. She's the author of Between Art and Artifact, Archaeological Replicas and Cultural Production in Oaxaca, Mexico, and co-editor of Edible Identities, Food as Cultural Heritage. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brulotte.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to join you all, and I appreciate Lisa's invitation to give this talk. And we're right next door in New Mexico. And I guess I just want to start by situating myself in relationship to this topic. As Lisa noted, I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and I've worked in Oaxaca, Mexico. I first lived there in 1995 as an undergraduate student, and then later went on to do my MA and PhD fieldwork in Oaxaca as well. So I've got a very long history with the region. And I should preface my talk by saying I don't consider myself a mezcal expert by any means. And there's probably people in here on this call that may even know more about mezcal than I do. Mostly my interest in mezcal stems from the transformations that I see occurring in Oaxaca more generally, and particularly as Oaxaca becomes a center of craft that is globally recognized. And when I say craft, I use the term pretty broadly. Obviously Oaxaca is known for its many beautiful handicrafts, but it's increasingly becoming known for a lot of artisanal foods and drinks, and mezcal is probably one of the most notable. So that's what I'm mostly interested in terms of my own academic research. Tonight, the talk is going to just be a very general overview of kind of some of the distinguishing features of mezcal, and why we might think of it as a craft drink, even more so than tequila and some other drinks people might be familiar with, and sort of what that status as a craft drink, for the most part, the kind of paradox that is set up by its entry into a global market. I think that'll kind of become clear as we move through some of the images and talk about some of the particularities of mezcal as a drink. I love this photo because it's from a few years ago when one of a local brand, El Rey Zapoteco, they started launching their product in Europe, and one of the people from their distillery went and he photographed their bottle at the Eiffel Tower. And I think this is really symbolic of sort of Oaxaca and mezcal, by extension's global reach. It's kind of making its way slowly around the world. Certainly there's more places where it's more popular than other places, but you can now find mezcal all over the world. Back when I was a young student, before the days of cell phones and internet and all those things, Oaxaca, it looked very different than it does today. And one of the things that I try to stress to people is that the onslaught of the mezcal industry, the way people are experiencing today, is, it's very different from what it looked like, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. This is a town that's about half an hour outside of Oaxaca City, which is the state capital, and it's a major center of mezcal production. It's Santiago Matatlan, and one of the things now is the town is billing itself as the world capital of mezcal. And since this photo was taken, they have built a touristic route right through the town. I'm actually writing about it. To what degree it's been successful in drawing tourism is another topic altogether, but there's been some rapid changes as a result of the incursion of kind of the global entrepreneurs looking for product. So one thing to keep in mind is that mezcal has, for the most part, been historically made in a very, I hate to use the term rustic, but a pretty non-mechanical manner. It's often been made in at the level of household production. So families or extended families making mezcal in quite literally backyard setups, right? Backyard distilleries. That's a photo I took up in the Mixteca, which is a region of Oaxaca that's actually not as well known for its mezcal, but I think it's increasingly becoming so. But people would make mezcal in communities, for consumption in the household or for sale to other people in the community, right? For weddings and fiestas. Some entrepreneurs might take their mezcal and sell it in regional markets, or even go to the city and sell it to some cantinas and watering holes. But for the most part, mezcal was not something that these folks here in the corner would not be dealing with. Some guy in, I don't know, San Francisco, California, that wants to start a mezcal bar, right? That's a really recent phenomenon, and it's really changed a lot of people's interactions with other parts of Mexico and other parts of the world. To just see, to kind of present a stark contrast, mezcal is becoming increasingly popularized. And, to the extent that not just that shows up on a bar menu, but we're seeing whole venues revolving around mezcal. This is a bar called Mama Rabbit that just opened in 2019 in Las Vegas, Nevada, by a well-known Oaxacan chef, Bricia Lopez, who has been one of the folks I would say most responsible for making people in the US aware of Oaxacan food. This place touts the largest mezcal collection of a bar in the United States. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't been there and I haven't counted them, but you can see that they've really fused the idea of mezcal as a drink with Oaxaca as a colorful folkloric place. And they really use craft in the form of material culture, the well-known animal figurines, known as alebrijes. Some of you might have bought one of those on your trip. That motif has really blended together. And I think there's this really close relationship with other craft products in Oaxaca, and the marketing of mezcal itself draws on a lot of the imagery and colors of those folk arts for which Oaxaca is so well known. So in a very short period of time, mezcal has gone from mostly contained in these sorts of smaller communities, to some degree regional markets in Oaxaca, lesser degree national level markets, to this incredibly international place that is Las Vegas, Nevada, where you have people coming through here from all over the world. So the question here to start us off, because I don't know that everybody's aware of what mezcal actually is. I always, I give other talks that go a little bit deeper into some of the more kind of social economic issues, but tonight I want to talk about just some basics so that you have some talking points when somebody asks you, what do you know about mezcal? So I want to talk about how mezcal is situated in relationship to other drinks that we tend to associate with Mexico, and importantly addressing what is mezcal versus tequila, right? It's often contrasted as, tequila's smokier cousin, right? Which a lot of us that have, think about mezcal really don't like those kinds of comparisons, because it sort of loses the uniqueness of the different products. And it oftentimes, I've seen the move where tequila is now seen as sort of an inferior product, which I think is also a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know if we have too much time to go into that, but this sort of new embrace of mezcal at the same time has sort of entailed a certain form of negation of tequila's status as the premier, symbol of alcoholic Mexico, right? I'm going to talk about the denomination of origin and the regulatory framework. Whoops, I got a typo there. That should be framework, not framework. And then I'm going to talk about the, how we can think about mezcal as craft and, its relation to sort of standardization in terms of production, which is something that people in the mezcal industry talk about quite a bit. So one of the things that people often ask me first and foremost, and actually right before this talk, I got on a website from the state, the Mexican federal, what is it called? Sector, which is like the agency that oversees tourism in Mexico. And they were talking about how mezcal was the premier, sort of pre-Hispanic beverage of Mexico. And people ask this all the time. Is it something that people were drinking here before the Spanish conquest? The generally accepted answer is it is not a pre-Hispanic drink. There's been sort of a movement within Mexico by a very limited group of, I would say, ethno-historians and archaeologists who are trying to assert that there's archaeological evidence of distillation technologies in Mesoamerica prior to, pre-contact. But the general thinking is that it wasn't something that was known at the time. However, the pre-Hispanic peoples did drink alcohol in the form, if we're talking about agave, a drink called pulque, which is a fermented drink that is made from the sap of agave. And this, as you can see, the most common one being the agave pulquero, an agave that is very much favored for producing pulque. So we have evidence of that, much less so for mezcal and other distillates, being that distillation was a technology that was brought over in the process of the pre-Columbian exchange. Okay. The kind of the landscape, the geography. I'm in a geography department, so we've always got to show a map. So the geography of mezcal and other drinks is interesting, and I hope this is the latest. There's been a lot of additions and to this list of who produces what over the last decade or so. But this map shows, the regions of different agave spirits, and it includes sotol, which some would say is technically not an agave, it's a different plant, but it's kind of gets lumped in there because it's similar in its production and so on. They're the ones that are highlighted in yellow produce not just one type of drink, but they may have another type of drink. So Durango produces sotol, but it also has, a mezcal denomination of origin in some places. And I'll talk about what that is in a second. One of the things that you'll notice here is the green are the mezcal production areas, right? And when I say that they produce agave spirits, what that means is that they have a legal designation that allows them to commercialize the drinks that are regulated as tequila, mezcal, sotol, and in the case of Sonora, which you guys might be familiar with being in Arizona, is bacanora. We tend to think of these drinks as very place-based, and particularly with the case of, tequila, which you can see here, number 9, Jalisco, and mostly we associate tequila with Jalisco. But it's also made, for example, in the state of Tamaulipas, where if you look on the map, Tamaulipas is number 7. It's over on the eastern coast of Mexico, right? So, if the idea behind these drinks is that they're rooted in a place, there's a very important term called terroir, which comes from French. This idea of a product being the, kind of confluence of environment and the culture, and you can get the soils and the wind conditions, to kind of call something tequila in a place and then have another place on an extreme opposite part of the country, right? You might ask, well, what is that about? Why, they don't obviously have the exact same, environment to produce tequila. And what I want to say here is that a lot of this is very political. The politics of who gets to produce what and call it a particular name is highly contested. There's a lot of fighting and things change. But as far as I understand, the Tamaulipas having a tequila designation is I think there was one powerful politician at some point in time that fought to get the designation and received it. So you always have to remember there's a very strong political element to all of these things and the way that they're being marketed. That said, I just want to bring your attention really quickly here to number 14 on the map, which is the southern state of Oaxaca. The capital city is Oaxaca, so it's the same name. Sometimes people use them and interchangeably and people don't know what we're talking about. But the state of Oaxaca produces, depending who you talk to, somewhere between 85 and 95% of Mexico's mezcal. So even though all those other green states on the map also can produce mezcal legally and sell it as mezcal, Oaxaca is still, by far the region that is producing the majority of the mezcal, probably the majority of mezcal that you'll buy as a consumer in the United States. Okay. This is a kind of an important point here, is that mezcal refers both to what I'm going to explain here in a moment, a particular denomination of origin, right? But it also is an umbrella term that generally refers to any agave distillate. So if you think about that, then we would need to understand that tequila is actually a type of mezcal, okay? Tequila is an agave distillate, but it has particular legal conditions under which it can be produced. And that's why not all mezcal is tequila, right? Because the mezcal produced in Oaxaca has a different sort of set of rules that govern its production. Just generally tequila, so everybody's aware, it's produced in those regions that you saw on the map. A big center of production is the highlands of Tequila, the town of Tequila. It must be produced of blue agave, which is, you might have seen on the label. And if people really want to stress the quality of their product, they'll say it's 100% blue agave, agave tequilana. And it has, you can actually add other things to tequila that isn't the case for all the other denominations of origin. I included this picture here. This is just I grabbed this photo of a bottle that's, probably you can find at any liquor store where you are. Tequila Espolon. This is a picture of their production facility near Arandas, Jalisco. And what I want you to notice is sort of this, looking at, from those pictures I showed a little bit earlier, the size of their facility. We might say this is industrial in the sense that they're using, they're producing it at, large quantities. They're using, large autoclave cookers that, probably have timers. I mean, these are not people building fires in their backyards, right? They have industrial technology that they're applying to make this product. One of the features that for many people will distinguish mezcal from tequila, mezcal, the denomination of origin drink, is the smokiness. And where the smoke is coming from in mezcal, it has a lot to do with the way that the agave is cooked in a lot of tequila production facilities, because they're producing at large scale for a large commercial market. They're cooking the agave hearts in large ovens. So they're actually cooking them sort of by steaming them. They're cocido and they're steam cooked, as opposed to cooked using a fuel source that is wood, thereby creating a smoky flavor in the agave. So the smoke comes from the processing of the agave in a different way. And I should note that there are artisanal tequilas that taste smoky, right? So it's not a defining feature of mezcal. It's just that many of the mezcals that we get are quote unquote artisanal mezcal, and they're cooked a particular way. Okay. So this denomination of origin that I've been talking about, sometimes you'll see it abbreviated just simply as DO. Denominations of origin are really important to the spirits industry in Mexico, and not only the spirits industry, which I'll show in just a second, but this idea that products are tied to place, right? We see it over and over again in a lot of things that we're familiar with outside of tequila and mezcal. You think of this picture I have got here of San Marzano tomatoes, right? You might have come across them if you went to, particularly like a Whole Foods. They tend to be more expensive. They tend to be sold in more upscale types of grocery stores in the United States. You see it says DOP certified. This idea that these tomatoes are a particular variety that were grown in a particular region, right? And the denomination of origin's purpose is to sort of protect the integrity of the products, protect the market and the producers that make these things in these particular places. And as I mentioned before, the denomination of origin is really about the geographic environment, but not only the natural environment, but the human environment, right? The human factors, what I've heard one mezcal brand owner refer to as the hand of the maker, right? So the cultural knowledge, as well as the environmental conditions and the physical landscape that go together to create the thing that we're calling mezcal or tequila. This all came out of something that was called the Lisbon Agreement that was codified in 1958. And this is where we start seeing the organization of these protected statuses at an international level. And we start to see people thinking about particular products associated with place, but also production methods, right? A lot of the things that we think of as protected tend to be craft products. They're produced in a certain way that has, kind of continuity throughout time. They're very tied to local cultural institutions and communities. And the Lisbon Agreement sort of makes the kind of a legal framework or apparatus that people can start recognizing those things, right? That's why champagne is champagne, and it's sparkling wine if you go some other place. It's cava or some other name. Parma ham. True Parmesan cheese is not the stuff that you buy that says Wisconsin on it. That's not true Parmesan cheese. It's Parmesan style cheese based on the cheese that comes from this particular place in Italy. So the denomination of origin for tequila and mezcal come out of this history, right? This idea that things are tied to place and that there's a kind of a historical production methods and techniques and knowledge associated with them, as well as the climatic factors. In Mexico, denominations of origins, the very first one was actually tequila, which was put into law in 1974. And I think it was the very first denomination of origin in all of Latin America. So it was a really early one. Since that time, there's been many others. The mezcal denomination of origin goes into effect in 1995. So there's, nearly a 20-year period where mezcal is not even recognized as such, right? It's just sort of this loose term. It doesn't have a set of conditions governing its production. People just make it, they sell it, they drink it, and they're not really commercializing it in the way that we see now. Coincidentally, in 1995, one of the first artisanal brands starts entering the U.S. market. An artist by the name of Ron Cooper, who has a brand Del Maguey, started, bringing his brand called Del Maguey to the U.S. consumer. It's still around. You probably have seen it in a bar. It has green bottles. The fact that the market happens in 1995, that the first artisanal mezcal starts coming to the U.S. in 1995, and the DO happens in 1995, that's not a coincidence. Just quickly, if you look at the other denominations of origin, they're not all food, interestingly, right? You've got vanilla, you've got bacanora, coffee, but you also have things like Talavera pottery, right? So again, you see this idea of locally based craft work, very much tied to this idea of locally produced foods or agricultural products. Chiapas, the jewelry that if you've ever gone to Chiapas and, have had people walk up to you with amber jewelry, that's another denomination of origin. Okay. So what does the denomination of origin for mezcal look like today? This is my translation of the current definition. One thing that distinguishes mezcal from tequila is that it must be 100% agave. And tequila, like as I said before, I think it has to be 51%, 49%. I don't have that number in my head, but you can look it up after the talk. And it's the distillation of fermented juice with Mexican yeast. A lot of producers will let it sort of naturally ferment by the airborne yeast in whatever their local environment is. It comes from, the hearts of cooked maguey, which is another term that people use in Mexico, particularly in Oaxaca, to mean agave. And it must be produced in the territory that has that denomination of origin that you saw on the map. So what do you see here? You see a very broad definition. You'll remember a few minutes ago, I said tequila had to be one type of agave. This doesn't specify that. You can use different types of agave. I think Lisa sort of alluded to that at the beginning of the presentation. This broad definition leaves tremendous room for diversity, and this room for diversity really is sort of at the heart of what we think about when we think of craft, right? The idea that things are not standardized, that the individual maker has the leeway to produce in the way that they want, right? That it is their sort of artistic product, if you will, right? And some of the other products don't have, they have much more rigid guidelines, right? And it sort of creates a more standardized version of the finished product. So you've got room for diversity, the biological diversity, in terms of any number of agaves that can be used to make mezcal. You have geographic diversity. You saw that region includes not only Oaxaca, but lots of other states as well, with also very different climates, different cultural groups. It's not one particular indigenous group of people or one particular region. There's a lot of room in this large denomination of origin. And so you're going to get a lot of variation, right? And the cultural variation, obviously. I just included this map. This is one of the older maps that, used to get as a fold out. If you bought any book that came out about mezcal in the last 10 or 15 years, there's always a copy of this map inserted in it. And I like it just because it shows, kind of the geographic diversity of agaves. And it's not even comprehensive, I should say, that, there's agaves that are not represented on here. But what you can see is that agave grows throughout Mexico, and even parts of Mexico we don't think of as making mezcal or any sort of agave distillates. You look at the Yucatan Peninsula, nobody ever says, oh, I had the best mezcal the other night from, Merida, right? But, the sort of distribution of agaves is really, it's pretty extensive, and it's very varied in terms of the types of agaves. And Oaxaca also has tremendous, ecological diversity, but Oaxaca is not the only state. And like I said, we tend to think the best mezcal comes from Oaxaca. There's, that's a very silly claim, very subjective claim, maybe that's a better word. It really varies, and you can find interesting, profiles of products throughout the country. I want to talk about some other sort of, if we think about the variables, if we think about mezcal making as a series of different variables that go into its production, then you can kind of see why mezcal has this kind of infinite quality in terms of being a craft distillate. It's not, I would say there's probably no two mezcals that are alike, maybe even by the same producer, because there is so much variability in the entire, from the beginning to the end of the production process. And that starts in the field, right? The most common agave a lot of the agave that you buy in the United States is made of a type of agave called espadín, which is a widely domesticated agave. It grows throughout Oaxaca. You can see in certain parts when you're driving through the highway, there'll be fields of it. These are some photos I took during my field work. I worked in a Palenque, which is an agave mezcal production facility, and we went out one day to cut some agaves. I included the one in the bottom left-hand corner just to illustrate the idea of intercropping. You know, historically people, and today still people will intercrop agaves with other things. You know, very typically the three sisters, as we call them, right? The, you know, squash, beans, and corn. So you can see oftentimes other crops growing in between. And, you know, if we think about variation, you know, at the level of soil content and nutrients, you know, the intercropping produces a unique soil environment. So, you know, some people would say that the finished mezcal would actually reflect that, right? So that the fact that you grew corn and beans at the base of your mezcal, you might be able to taste some, you know, distinct flavor in your mezcal. I can't prove or disprove that, but that's one of the ways that people talk about variability. I just include this fun picture in the bottom right-hand corner. If you've ever seen a bottle that said Mezcal de Pechuga, it's a type of mezcal. So mezcal can also be flavored. And when I mean flavored, I'm not talking about like a wine cooler, but during the distillation process, in the case of Mezcal de Pechuga, people oftentimes put in a chicken breast, a turkey breast, seen rabbit breast, and it creates a different flavor. It sort of diffuses in there, and the essence of the meat goes into the finished product, right? And they'll put fruits sometimes, different herbs. I've seen chocolate. I've seen all kinds of things go into mezcal. So, you know, depending what bottle you buy, you might find that it's got that element, right? So not only people are making mezcal, they're kind of cooking too. They're kind of like there's an element of cuisine and thinking about what sorts of flavors might combine well. You know, allspice berries are used a lot in Oaxaca, and so you might see that in your mezcal. And then I know somebody had a question early on about wild agaves, right? And I included these just so you can see the diversity of kind of habitats where mezcal, agave grow. And you know, you saw the neatly planted fields where people, you know, could use maybe, you know, a tractor and to go through and till and what have you. But some of these agaves really are growing in, you know, just wild, oftentimes hard to reach places, right? As the one you see there on the cliff. So it's very difficult, you know, to use kind of a mechanized harvesting even, right? The way you could if you know, had a nice flat field where you can drive a pickup truck through. So a lot of places, you know, contributing this idea of artisanal or the craft nature of mezcal is that, you know, you'll still see people with a horse or a donkey, like in the monte, going up and cutting agaves, right? So, you know, that's another thing that still persists in mezcal in a way that it doesn't in tequila, where most of the agave is, you know, commercially produced on larger farms. Not all cases, but oftentimes. And then there's the processing of agave for mezcal overwhelmingly still takes place in very small scale, kind of rustic pits that oftentimes heated using wood. Different kinds of wood can produce different flavors. So, you know, most of the cutting of the agave is all done by hand, usually with machetes and a kind of an arsenal of other pretty simple tools. And then the agaves are taken, roasted, and you can see them being loaded there. And essentially what you want to achieve through roasting is the concentration of the sugar. So once you cook the agave hearts, right, they cut them at the time that the sugar is concentrated in that part of the plant, then they cook it. It has a very caramelized taste, which are notes you'll often taste in the finished product as well. And sometimes people in Mexico will eat the cooked agave almost like candy. I've seen it sold in stores, just, you know, kids will suck on it. In terms of, you know, crushing agave, so it can be fermented. So you have to ferment it before you can distill it. You see a range of techniques that can be from what's called maso y canoa, which is essentially kind of a pit in the ground where people use these large wooden mallets to pound it. It's very labor intensive and difficult. Then oftentimes, if you've been to Oaxaca, probably more commonly you've seen a giant stone wheel called a tajona, which is pulled by a horse and it crushes under the weight of the giant stone. But even, more recently, people, the government had a program a few years ago where they were giving these kits to mezcal producers, and it included, in some cases, what I've heard disparagingly referred to as a wood chipper by some folks, right? It's an agave chipper, essentially. So you put the agave heart in, it kind of shreds it mechanically. And this idea of creating, what tastes better, again, that's always very subjective, but the discourse about what is better mezcal, what is true mezcal, I've heard a lot of U.S. folks really complain about these sorts of technologies, saying it tastes different, it's not the same, because we tend to associate the original production, the most artisanal production, is having the highest value and the best taste and the best quality. Again, a very subjective thing, but it's very real in the minds of people that are consuming the product, which is part of the marketing too, right? Which I'll come to in a second. You can ferment mezcal in a lot of receptacles, and I'm realizing I'm getting close to running out of time, so I'm going to start wrapping up here. I've seen it in hide, I've seen it in plastic, I've seen it in a washing machine tub, I've seen it in wood. Again, another variable that affects the flavor. You can distill in copper, ceramic, stainless steel. Again, all those will produce different sorts of flavors, and you'll see in Oaxaca the whole gamut of types, different types of stills. And then the recent one of the biggest controversies, and I bring this up here because I think it's important to think about this idea of craft. As more and more mezcal started entering the commercial market, some saw a need. It was, again, not everybody. A lot of people really hated this movement to sort of modify the regulatory framework of the denomination of origin to further designate within the category of mezcal these other sort of subcategories, and to tell the consumer you were buying craft mezcal or you were buying, they initially called it industrial mezcal, right? Which people that made industrial mezcal really reacted to, because if you can imagine, your bottle says industrial mezcal, right? Your first thought is, oh gosh, the snooty people in the United States that want the craft mezcal aren't going to buy my mezcal, right? So there was backlash. So they initially started with industrial mezcal, but then they changed it to mezcal. But this, if you look at this isn't really any different than tequila, right? It's the same kinds of, large, industrial technology that they use to make tequila. The only difference is they may be using different agaves, or, it may actually not taste that much different than tequila. Artisanal mezcal, one of the key differences in this sort of sub-distinction is that it's still made in a particular kind of still. And then ancestral mezcal, the still is even more considered more rustic. It's clay instead of copper. And this category too was sort of weird and controversial. Ancestral mezcal, how is that different than artisanal mezcal? They're both artisanal, but ancestral, and then the question of what ancestor you're talking about, right? I personally think it's meant to evoke sort of a pre-Hispanic technological kind of setup, but I'll leave it there. That'll be for you to investigate further. So I'll end here because I think this is where, maybe we can, talk about it some more in the Q&A. As mezcal becomes more and more integrated into global markets and the demand goes up, right? I think what is on a lot of people's mind is, how do you maintain all of these things that go into making mezcal a craft or artisanal drink if you start trying to scale up? So what is the effects of producing at scale? I mean, tequila, they can make tequila for the U.S. market because they have these large industrial facilities. But as you see, Mescal doesn't have that infrastructure. And some would say it should get that infrastructure. Some would say, no, we want to keep Mescal as the sort of, rustically produced small batch type of product. But then how do you meet your demand? Obviously, what at the base of all that is, what is the price of Mescal going to be? And so that's where we are today in many cases, where people in the United States will pay $200 for a bottle of Mescal. I always go back to something a friend of mine in Oaxaca told me one time. She said, Oaxaca ya no es para Oaxaqueños. And that means Oaxaca is no longer for Oaxacans. And Oaxaca has become a place that has become increasingly gentrified. It's become increasingly touristic. And a lot of local folks, can't really afford to even live in the world that is sold to tourists anymore. And I guess the question is Mescal kind of following a similar trajectory as part of that, wider branding of a place. So I know we're out of time. If you want to learn more, there's some great websites you can go. Mezcalistas are some folks based out of California that have done a lot of writing and reporting on the Mescal industry. There's a blog. I think he hasn't contributed to it for a while. He also has a book, Mescal PhD. And if you're interested about the regulatory framework I talked about for the denomination of origin, you can look at the website. It's in Spanish. I think they don't have it in English, but if you read Spanish, you can look at, if you want to look at the actual kind of legal terminology and their different applications and all that, you can find it there. But I will end there, and I'd love to hear some questions from you all. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rhonda. One person asked, are the people of the area selling in the global market, or has a corporation come in and is starting to take over?
Yeah, that's a complicated one. Del Maguey, which, as I mentioned, was one of the first, if we're going to say artisanal mezcals, Del Maguey was bought by a large, multinational alcohol corporation, right? So it's both. You see everything from literally the guy in the backyard making mezcal, having great dreams of taking his mezcal to the United States. I heard, when I did field work in Oaxaca, I hear that over and over again. I want to export mezcal, but the double-edged sword of this regulatory framework is that you have to go through a certification process to get your product certified as mezcal, to get it legally registered and trademarked as a product in Mexico, that then you can ship it, and export it to other countries. And then there's a whole host of, export rules and guidelines that vary from country to country. Sarah Bowen, I think I sent the reference, if you guys can share that, wrote an interesting book. It's called Divided Spirits. And she's a sociologist who studied tequila and mezcal. And she makes the point that the certification process has been a real barrier for a lot of small producers that probably don't have the economic resources or just the educational levels to, it's a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy. And if you're a peasant farmer in rural, the rural Mixteca, it might be hard for you to undergo that and get your product even ready where it's legally able to be exported, right? So you see everything. If you're interested in sort of the intrusion of multinational corporations into the agave spirits market, I would recommend, what's her name, Chantal, it's Martineau, I believe is her last name. She wrote a book that's very interesting. It's called How Gringos Stole Tequila, I believe. And it talks about this whole kind of incursion of different companies from the US into, basically they took, tequila used to be much more Mexican controlled, and it's much less in the hands of Mexicans, although some of the big companies still are. But those are two great books I recommend.
Okay, thank you. So let's see. Somebody just switched gear a little bit, wondered if chica, fermented drink from corn, is made in Mexico.
Chicha, yeah.
Chicha.
So chicha is, I would say, you can probably find, you can find versions of chicha throughout Latin America. You can find it in Peru, for example. There's an Andean tradition. You can find it throughout Mexico. different kinds of corn beers. It may not always be called chicha. For example, in northern Mexico, I think Yaqui and Tarahumara folks have historically made a fermented corn drink. I think it's called Tisquino. There's a good book, another book recommendation. It's called Alcohol in Ancient Mexico by his last name's Bruman. It was his doctoral dissertation written back in the 30s or 40s, but he does a really great survey of sort of archaeological and, other kinds of, different plants and stuff. And he surveys kind of the whole region looking at, different, mostly they're fermented drinks, for the most part, what people were doing and where, and, different parts of Mexico. That's a really great place if you want to learn more about corn beers.
So you touched on this a little, but does 100% agave mean no additives besides pechuga de pollo? But can sweeteners or colorants be added, for example?
I mean, legally, no. And I think ethically, people that are producing, should be adhering to guidelines. Do they always? In my field work, I would say no. I won't say who or where or when, but I mean, people do, it's like a lot of industries, you think you're buying something that has something on a label, but you really don't know, how it was produced. I mean, I've seen commercial fertilizer added to mezcal to speed up the fermentation process. Like I've seen people dump baker's yeast into fermenting vats to get the fermentation going, when supposedly it's airborne naturally, so yeah, I mean, yes, it's in practice, it's a little different. I would say probably most of the mezcal you buy does meet those guidelines. They don't add sugar to it. The sugar is the natural sugar occurring in the agave. And they should be using 100% agave, but I'm sure you could find cases where something's, a little off if you wanted to do some investigative reporting.
People do different things to the mezcal, because I know when we were in Oaxaca, we were introduced to mezcal, like we were at Porfirio Gutierrez's studio, and they offered us mezcal with cochineal in it, which I did not like. And I don't know if that's added afterwards. I'm kind of guessing because they're the weavers. And also mezcal with perecan, which is Mexican marigold, which I did like. And then one with marijuana in it, which I didn't try. So I've seen people with rattlesnakes. So the difference between, what you're describing, I think thinking about the worm in the bottle, people, always ask me, is that real? I'm like, yeah, it's a flavoring. It's a flavoring, right? Just like the pechuga is a type of flavoring. The worm in the bottle, I would say it probably best described was by the Spanish term infusión, like an infusion. So I've seen people, take mezcal that's been made and they'll put nanche fruit or put something in it, but that's not that they're using that in brewing or not brewing in the distillation or fermentation. It's sort of something that they're adding after to give a different flavor, right? Whether that's an herb or something. That was my feeling, that they were coming in afterwards.
Yeah, that's probably generally what you're going to encounter.
So you mentioned Mexican yeast, and somebody asked, and I'm also curious, what's the difference between Mexican yeast and the type of yeast we buy in the United States, Fleshman's yeast to make bread?
Oh, well, I guess I should say, there's like, if you go to Mexico and you want to bake bread, you can go to the grocery store and buy yeast just like you can in the United States. But a lot of a naturally fermented product, there's yeast spores floating in the air. So if you just leave, it's like if you ever try to ferment something on your kitchen counter, you don't add yeast to it, right? You just let it ferment. Whatever yeasts are in the air will get activated and help the fermentation process and whatever you're trying to ferment. So when I say Mexican yeast, I mean just whatever naturally occurring yeast are in the local environment. But then there's, bread baking yeast, which I don't know what the brand is even in Mexico, but it's probably the same thing as in the US.
Okay. So the next one turns to who's doing all the work. So the production requires a lot of manual labor. Who is doing the labor? Are they profiting too from the expansive growth of sales? Could you describe to what extent they are profiting? And I'd also wonder gender-wise how the craft is made.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of things, you know, we have this, I mean, I grew up on a farm, right? My dad's a hop grower. So I grew up in the hop industry, and, you know, you have these fantasies of like the small guy out there nourishing his hops and then, you know, making a craft beer in his kitchen. But that's just not the reality of most agricultural production, even on these small scale industries, right? Is that there are people that might, you know, grow or harvest the agave themselves, make the mezcal themselves, bottle it and sell it themselves. But, you know, this idea of one single person being a producer from the very beginning of the product to, you know, its final state. It's like a lot of craft work in Oaxaca is not made by, you know, we think of a wood carving is made, you know, there's an artisan. If you actually look at the chain of how a wood carving is produced, oftentimes they're even carved in different villages or by a different person. Men do the carving, women tend to paint. There's a division of labor. And I would say you see the same thing in the mezcal industry, where you have people that are, you know, they're field workers where their primary job is to go in and harvest the agaves, right? Because it's not easy, right? There's a specific craft, you know, no pun intended, there's particular knowledge in cutting the agave in a correct way. Not everybody can do it, right? So you may hire somebody to harvest your agave for you, then you bring it back to your distillery. I own the distillery, but there I have a crew of people working, and they're all going to be paid different rates, different scales, depending what they're doing. A lot of the heavier labor is not performed by women because it's hard, physically hard. And it's also probably, I would say, historically not been deemed as socially acceptable for women to do specific I mean, like lifting a 200-pound agave heart rate. But women do work in distilleries, usually more on the bottling, kind of labeling, that sort of end of things. But yeah, that's another, if you read Sarah Bowen's book, the one Divided Sphere, she talks about that as well, the discrepancies between the wage workers and the, you know, particularly that, like the people that harvest agaves. I mean, they're just low paid agricultural workers, you know, that certainly aren't, you know, reaping the benefits of a 200 bottle of mezcal and sold in San Francisco. So there's a lot of wage disparity across the production cycle.
Right. So that one. Okay. So how, in terms of like labor rights and wages and cost of living, how is the growth of the mezcal industry affecting the producers, the farmers, and others involved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you have to remember is that, you know, I mean, Mexico has still, you know, this idea of like farm workers' rights. I think it's, you know, it's not the same as the United States. There's not like a movement for fair wage. I mean, I think and this is something I haven't studied, I think other people have written about it, but it's, you know, this idea of creating cooperatives, for example, in a community that can sort of negotiate fair prices for products or get fair prices for, you know, a lot of folks don't necessarily grow their agave. Like they may be getting it from a farmer. Agave doesn't grow everywhere, right? There's parts, even Oaxaca, there's parts of Oaxaca that the climate's more conducive to growing espadín agave, for example. People may have their processing facility in another part of the state, and they might be buying with a farmer that's in another part of the state, right? So there's this whole kind of you know, chain there, and I think you see a lot of variability. But I would say the general consensus is that handful of people, producers, are doing really well. There's a lot of people that still aren't. It's just like with other crafts, you know, there's a handful of very well-known Oaxacan artisans that, you know, you guys are doing a show on tapetes, the weavings. I mean, the people that get their weavings in the museums and galleries and the International Folk Art Market here in New Mexico, where I live, those are people that are doing really well oftentimes, not always, but they've often had, a patron, right? They've had buyers, they've worked with brokers in the US, maybe in Mexico City. You say the same thing with mezcal, those that have been lucky enough to connect with, somebody that has capital to back a brand, and the certification process may do really well, and, become the poster boy for the successful entrepreneur in an indigenous village. Meanwhile, his neighbor down the road may be producing a very similar product, and their product never sees the light of day in a national or certainly not an international market. So there's a lot of thinking about where's the capital coming from. Following the capital flow is very important to understanding how people are benefiting or not from commercialization.
Yeah, that makes sense. I saw that even with the few artisans we visited. And
yeah.
One potter, for example, was very proud. She had a pot in one of the big museums in New York. And it's like, yeah, and her work cost a little more than the other potters, but it's the same quality. It's the same clay. It's the same technique.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes sometimes there are people I don't want to despair. I mean, there's people that with extreme talent and do these really beautiful,
of course,
masterworks, but there's also people that just got lucky, honestly, and you go to the town where they make the black clay pots, and there's somebody that might be selling pieces to a folk art boutique in Santa Fe, got lucky, and then their neighbor is lucky if they can sell a little piece to a tourist that passes through the village, and you're going to see that in their standards of living,
right. So a couple more questions. How old is the agave when it's harvested? Because you're going to take the heart of it, and that destroys the plant. So
yeah, so that's a good point. So agave for mezcal is a kind of a single use function, a one-time thing. Unlike pulque, which you go back because you're harvesting sap, you can keep using the same pulque plants. The agave, once they cut it, that's it. It depends on the variety. That's why oftentimes people prefer using the domesticated espadín, is that it grows relatively fast, and usually it's ready to harvest between 6 and 8 years. But that's still, if you think about it, that's a long period of time. I mean, imagine if you grew, like if I had to wait for my hops to grow 6 or 7 years, and what a market can do from the time you plant a crop to the point which you harvest it, there's going to be huge fluctuations in a market. So if you think about it from the standpoint of investment risk, right? So you're a peasant farmer, right? This kind of goes against the way we typically think about peasant economies, right? Peasant economies tend to be, they tend to favor low risk as opposed to agribusiness, which can afford to take higher risks. Peasant economies tend to be based on, year-to-year subsistence level production, whereas, agribusiness, you're kind of thinking down the road, the market's going to do this. So that's made a lot of folks kind of have to play in this different sort of economic strategy than what historically would have been, what subsistence farmers would have done. Some of those wild agaves, those big ones you saw, may take up to, 12 to 13 years to mature. So, that's a really long time.
So a few more kind of related questions. When they harvest the agave, are the leaves used for anything that they're cut off, or are they just tossed into the compost pile?
Oh, yeah. Well, you see different things happening. Some people, may kind of compost them. I've seen, it depends on what kind of agaves, but, if you go to certainly central Mexico, they, historically did a lot of building with them, right? Like houses on, the roofs could be agave, the pencas, which are the leaves. If you ever saw the tips of an agave, they're very sharp. In pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica, they use the tips as sewing needles. So I don't think people do that anymore, but historically people would have used the plant, in its entirety. I think it's probably much less so, but it's stuff that, the stuff that's left over can always be used in other ways to kind of, fertilize fields and things like that.
And I know traditionally also that fibers could be used in weaving as well.
Yeah. Yep.
So the wild agave just grows wherever it grows. And I want to come back to that in a minute. But for the espadine or the commercially harvest and planted agave, two questions on that. One, is it always blue agave? And then the other is, how does it affect water usage? Because the wild is just out there, right?
Yeah.
But the fields of agave that people plant.
Yeah, so so it's rarely blue agave actually. So blue agave is the tequila one. The espadine tends to be the most common planted
and that's the name of the type of agave, is espadine?
Yeah, espadine. But even what we're calling wild agaves, many of them are now they're grown, right? So they're not just obtained out, like I saw it on the hillside, I'm gonna go cut it. But people are now, I guess the term would be like semi-cultivated, right? So they'll get a wild agave, they'll kind of, watch it, help it grow, and then cut it. I've heard there's a guy, he has a brand, I'm blanking on the name, Vago is the brand, Judah Cooper. He refers to them as rare agaves, which is, I think, to get at the fact that they're not as common as espadine, but nor are they 100% just in the wild. Right. So that terminology gets a little bit gray. And so, you're saying wild agave on a bottle may or may not mean that this literally was just out in the wild and I found it and I cut it down.
It's a different type than espadine, which is the kind when you drive down the road and you see the fields, it's usually
it's the most common, like commercially planted.
So when you're commercially planting, how does that affect water use?
I don't know as much about the water. I mean, one of the things with agave, and that's why it's a endemic plant, is that it's a drought resistant plant. So I mean, it was stuff that was growing, and you guys living in the desert just like we are, we use here in New Mexico, probably in Arizona too, sotol as a landscaping plant. Because it's an incredibly drought tolerant, it's a great desert plant. And so a lot of these, I mean, that's why people are, have used agaves, when they came and brought distillation technologies and they weren't using, grapes to make brandy. They found these plants in the natural environment. So they're well suited to their natural environment. So, they were actually trying to get farmers in Chihuahua to plant sotol. It's a whole nother story I could do a presentation on, rather than, kind of the farming of like alfalfa and other sort of, things that were less drought tolerant because of the changing climatic conditions. So it's a drought tolerant plant.
And I believe the Fishes are doing Paul and Susie Fish, I believe, are doing a lecture as part of the Agave Festival coming up this next week, and you can learn how agave's been cultivated here in Southern Arizona, going back into pre-Hispanic times. If you're interested in that, I'm just going to mention that to people. I don't see any more questions, and I'm hoping that our discussion of wild agave answered Johanna's question that she had. But if anybody has another question, please real quickly put it in the Q&A. Let's see, here's one more. The process of making the liquor uses a large volume of water, but what is more concerning is the acidic byproduct as a result of the distillation, vinasse, which seeps into the soil and groundwater. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I don't know as much about the chemistry of it, but I do know that that's a concern. In the processing, what is, because people, where, you would ask yourself the question, where are people getting the water in these communities, right? Usually it's a local, sometimes it's a river. In Oaxaca, there's an area of different communities. There's San Juan del Rio, San Luis del Rio, and what they all have in the title of their community is Del Rio. So, there's a river running through these communities, and that's the primary water source. And there's a problem with contamination. I know that some of the brands that are trying to create a more sustainable profile for themselves are now talking about how they're dealing with the wastewater issue. To what extent that's actually being implemented and having success in communities, I do not know the answer to that.
Does
But it is certainly a
tequila also
concern.
have a wastewater problem? The
Does what?
production of tequila? I mean, how, because
I mean,
that's much more
anywhere,
mass produced.
but anywhere, yeah. I mean, there was water's always an issue, and especially in these water scarce environments. Recently, there was an issue with in Mexicali, yes, Mexicali, around beer production. Right, there's, it was on NPR. They covered it. Kind of the contamination and the using of water resources by these big, large, breweries. So it's always a concern. But to what degree is it, like I said, being addressed in Mexico, which has much more lax environmental protections in the United States, which is why people like to produce things in Mexico, right? U.S. companies go down there. I think that is often secondary to profit, and unfortunately, in many cases.
So thank you so much, Rhonda, for your expertise and explaining something that everybody's interested in trying and don't really understand what it is. I didn't know I'm allergic to blue agave, so I was delighted to know that I could actually drink mezcal and not get sick. That really, I learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure we all did. So thank you so very much. We appreciate your sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you. It was great to see you all, and I appreciate all the great questions.